All right.
Welcome, and Dr. Hunsinger, take it away.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you can make it. My training today is called Backward Design Mastery Learning and the Flipped Classroom. Oh my, a Sabbatical Odyssey, which is a play on words from two of my favorite movies, The Wizard of Oz, I believe that was 1937, a classic, and a 2001 A Space Odyssey. So hopefully my training will be half as interesting as either one of those movies. We'll find out. All right. So I am excited to talk about my sabbatical journey that led to my new course model that I'm actually teaching from this year. I have these pictures here because in my sabbatical year, I spent a lot of time swimming with my kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old at home. We also were able to go to Spain in March. We did see the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. Fun fact, it is scheduled to be completed in 2026. So we saw it in the almost completed section. Another fun fact, 100 years after Antonin Gaudi died in 1926. That's why they're kind of anxious to finish that up. But anyway, between swimming and gallivanting in Europe, I was also doing a lot of reading, research, and developing my courses so that when I came back to teaching, I was going to have a new experience for students, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. But before we get started, I want to hear a little bit from you. I want you to take a few minutes, and I want you to think to yourself, and then we can talk about it and share a bit. What are the telltale signs of a great class? How do students show it? I'm not necessarily talking about an assessment data or grades, but I'm talking more like that subjective experience. How do students show it? And how do you, as the instructor, know? So take a little bit to think about it, and then we'll call on a couple of folks. All right, so I'm going to pick on Najma since I see her on my screen right now. Najma, I know you're a teacher in the classroom on the side. How do you know when a great class is occurring?
That's a really great question. I would say just the engagement, right? They're actually not like, so for example, if they have discussions, they're not just giving one-worded answers, like they're actually putting thought into the course. And this might seem cliche, but even the evaluations, they'll tell you straight up if they thought the course was good or not, right? But I would just say their level of engagement, are they really putting thought, and they're really, trying, and how many questions are you getting too, so just kind of I would use those too.
Yeah, so how active they are, of course, how subjectively or how objectively they're doing on their assignments. Kath, what about you? What about biology?
So similar, you can see the interest in their eyes, I think. It may sound sort of strange to say that, but it's not just what's coming out of their mouth. I feel it's how animated they can become about a particular topic that can be very instructive as to whether they're getting something out of it or not. And then the second part, how does the instructor know? Again, sort of dovetailing into what Najma said, but also you can the instructor know? I don't know how I know. I just know it works. Like, it's relevant. I can see that. I don't know. I even feel the relevance. Like, not only do they feel the relevance and they're engaged, but I feel like somehow there's a piece of the puzzle that's being put together, and they're like, oh, this is how this relates to my real life. It's not just some random fact she's sharing with me. If that's
yeah, absolutely. They're connecting it to their lives for sure. Mm-hmm. Mary, I'm so glad you're joining us. remind me, you teach English, right?
I do, but at Estrella, it's just it's art humanities. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you great.
Okay, I was thinking about this. I think it's when there's a clear sense of community that the student voices are being heard. There's that clear sense of belonging, like
Mm.
there's just that sense of connection that's happening that you would feel it in a work group or with a group of parents or whatever sort of community you're in. It's just that sense of everyone has input in it and they're just very clearly engaged.
Mm. Hearing engagement, I'm hearing community. Like Kath was saying, this kind of sense of this energy. Sana, you are a fellow econ traveler with me. How do you see it? And not sure if you're muted or not. And of course, you may not have access to a microphone, and that's totally okay. Clarissa, how about you in business and accounting?
I would say, at least my face-to-face classes, it's a little bit easier to see. I think someone mentioned in their eyes, you can tell when things click, right? But uh, I've experimented the last couple of years with just stopping and saying, okay, Google it right now. Go your phones, use your computer, Google it. And just the engagement that comes from that. First of all, they're like, you want me to use my phone? But the fact that they can sort of speak from a little bit of knowledge, that's not highly technical research, but they feel a little more confident to speak up on what they see. And then they start to kind of discuss with authority, if you will, or confidence, and they don't run for the door the minute it's time to leave. So those kind of indicate for me that
I like that. They're not running for the door or they're not packing up, 7 minutes before class ends, right? Just, Liz, how about you in your communications classes?
This is gonna sound super cheesy, but you feel like there's almost magic being made, right? Like there's co-creation and knowledge sharing, like there's laughter, there's fun. Maybe there's also a little bit of like just those difficult questions. I teach communication courses, and one class is intercultural communication. So obviously the intersection of culture and how it really frames even our communication style. And sometimes students have a really hard time just kind of gaining that self-awareness. And then also like my interpersonal communication class, we talk about relationships. And so students get really deep. Sometimes they share a little too much. Though I think that, again, maybe going back to what some people have said, like there's community, there's relevancy, there's applicability, like they're starting to see the connections. And the magic is when they're like, oh my gosh, I learned about this in my psychology class and I now see how this is related. It's like, yes, like that's how knowledge builds on each other. So that is probably what I would say. Just like fun and learning all around, not just from what's in the textbook, but also from each other's lives.
Absolutely. Last one I'll pick on Pablo. He's in the room.
I'm going off what this says, this says that application can make it to.
Can you guys hear Pablo okay?
Speak up a little louder, Pablo.
So yeah, if students can connect to the material, and I think that's one of the best indicators. So even though I'm teaching something about, like, say, women's history, and I have a man in the class, but somehow they're able to relate to an experience in some shape or form. So that's always been kind of good. Or even Another way is just, again, this is more technical in regards to application, where they apply a concept that I lecture, say something like texture and Baroque art, and then I show art. They're able to tell me exactly where the texture is at, right? And how would it feel if they were to touch it and so forth. So those are those aha moments that I see.
It's almost like you can see the light bulb going off over their head, like in the cartoon. I like some of y'all were saying about, you see it in their eyes, the emotional resonance that's hard to measure, the sense of community, collaboration, interdisciplinary learning. There's a sense of trust, right? There's a sense of community. And I bring this up because, and sorry if I can get to everyone, I'm moving on here. I bring it up because I think it is good for us to think about, what are we looking for, right? Where is that, as Liz says, the magic that we want to see in our classes, and what conditions can we do ahead of time and during the class to maximize those chances of that happening for each of our sections. So just wanted to give you kind of a little quick history, my story, since it's my training, I get to talk about me. So, I've been teaching economics since as a full-time instructor since 2007. And like most of us, if you've been around, we pretty much started in person. There was this thing called the online and hybrid early on, but it was mostly in-person instruction. And probably like a lot of you, I started teaching the way I saw my university instructors teach, which was a lot of lecture and a lot of chalk and talk. And that was okay. I had a good time. There's a reason why we went into the teaching profession. And then in 2009, 2010, I believe, I wasn't quite ready to go completely online, but I was going to try this thing called hybrid learning. And let's just say, I wasn't prepared for that. I dealt with having half as much class time by trying to talk twice as fast. And with predictable results. And so I quickly ran away from that. It was the opposite of that high energy happiness. It was the fear of terror in my students' eyes as we were going at light speed. And then I became the CTL faculty director, the job Liz, Dr. Cantu has right now, for 6 years. And I was talking with Pablo before this. In that role, wasn't able to teach during the day because of the other duties I was fully reassigned for. And I have a couple of young kids at home, so I wasn't willing to teach in the evening in person. So I got decent at online, and I developed some online courses, course masters, and of course, working at the CTL and the professional development wing of the college, I was just, swimming in all sorts of active learning technology, backwards design. And then the last 2 years in that job, I was, we called it the facilitator of ACU. That's the Association of College and University Educators. I know some of you here have gone through those. I did both the online and just the general teaching, effective teaching practices. And so at that point, I bowed out and did a sabbatical where my goal was, okay, now that I've learned so much in this role and stepped away from the classroom for a while, how do I put it all together and create something new that I can bring back to the classroom this year? So I applied for sabbatical. This was the cover. It was, as you can see, in fall of 2023. This was where my head was. I was thinking about how do I flip the economics classroom, reinventing the economic principles using the flipped classroom model, which isn't exactly the newest concept, but definitely was different than the way most econ classes were taught. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this idea, but just a real quick primer. In the traditional classroom, the model is you have the instructor lecture with PowerPoint slides through most of the time, and then they assign work outside of class, where oftentimes like this little kid here struggle with applying the higher level thinking skills, feeling somewhat isolated perhaps in that endeavor. Whereas in the flipped classroom model, you are providing that foundational instruction outside of class, generally through maybe online lectures, readings, homework assignments, that type of stuff, so that they come to class ready to learn. And that's, we're talking about that magic of the collaboration and the community, and flipped classrooms really aligned with that, because now you're having students kind of working together through quote unquote homework, and having the instructor not be the sage on the stage, as they say, but either the guide on the side or the meddler in the middle. And so some of the things you can do in this active learning environment, some of these are from AQ and other places. I use somewhat frequently jigsaw worksheets. You can have like 8 or 10 questions and assign each table a question, and have them work on it for 5 or 10 minutes. And then we do a round robin, and each table presents on what they've learned. You can have them do whiteboard or worksheet practice questions. We know from the literature on neuroscience and education that when students are practicing recall, like it's called the testing effect, that this is helping them to integrate that learning into long-term memory. We also know that spacing learning over time is really effective. So taking breaks, allowing sleep to work its magic is super important. Similar to that, a little bit more of a high tech is polling software. Kahoots is one. I use Socrative. We have some time today. I'll be glad to show you how I do that for quizzing, for muddiest points, practicing recall, all that good stuff. I'm going to stop here and ask, been talking for a bit, if there's any questions or thoughts or comments. Okay, thank you. And feel free to add it to the chat. I can't see the chat right now. It's probably my error. So Liz or Najma, if you could, let me know if there's something pressing that I'm not seeing. I'd appreciate that.
We got you, Eric.
Thank you so much. I know you do. One of the biggest fears, complaints, obstacles that instructors report about flipping the classroom is if students are ready to flip. The biggest challenge is they assign all this great work ahead of time so that they come to class ready with foundational learning, but yet they don't do their homework. Who would have guessed students don't do the reading before class? And so that's one of the things you need to do in the classroom if you're going to flip, is make sure that there are accountability measures for both the student as well as the instructor to check on the students to make sure they're doing that work ahead. But even more foundationally, of course, you have to think about what is the learning that we want our students to do, and how will you know it, and how will they know that they know it? So that's where this idea of backwards design comes in. And probably many of you have seen this before, but if you think about, I'll talk about my journey as an adjunct faculty back in 05, 06 at a sister college. I remember, being very happy to be teaching one of the principal's classes, and I'd be sitting in the faculty lounge and have my yellow legal pad and thinking about, this is what the lesson plan I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and I got super excited. And then I would do the PowerPoint with the students, and they would sit quietly and attentively for the most part. Of course, this was before smartphones, that helped. But they had other ways of distracting themselves too. And then and then I'd be like, oh, it's week 4, it's time, we got to do a test. Well, I got to come up with some multiple choice questions, right? I might do that, and many of the students bombed, and that was unfortunate. And then later on, I found out about this thing called assessment, where found out our accrediting agency cares about how we measure student learning. And, I was like, oh, well, how do I placate my division chair and our accrediting agency? So I come up with some little assessment I could put into the class and keep them off my back. Today it's completely different. first you have to think about seriously, what are the major learning outcomes you want for your students, the big ideas and the skills. And then from there, how you have to think about how you're going to gather that information to see if those big ideas and skills have been developed and mastered. And then once you know what the goal is, now you start developing your learning events, experiences, and so forth that help scaffold your students to master those learning outcomes through your assessments. So we backwards design that. So I was in a privileged position because in our instructional council, right before I went on sabbatical, redeveloped our course level learning outcomes, otherwise known as course competencies, as well as the program learning outcomes for the Associate of Arts in Economics, with emphasis in economics. So this was right on time to think about these deeply and think about how to structure my course around those. And as a side note, I just wanted to mention that at other colleges in the district, the course competencies are the course level learning outcomes, the CLOs. At our college, a lot of classes, maybe 10 years ago, we kind of went down a path where we developed separate CLOs from the competencies. And I feel like that was a mistake. In fact, when I talk with colleagues in other instructional councils and we tell them about our process, they are kind of aghast that our CLOs are different from our competencies and wondering if that passes accreditation. So all I would say is if you are thinking about redoing your CLOs, if you're one of those that have classes that different than competencies, I would recommend considering just taking your course competencies, copy and paste them into your CLOs and go from there. That's a side note. I'm glad to talk about that later, but I've done it, Econ's done it, and no problems. So acceptable evidence, all right? Now we have our learning outcomes. Now we have to think about what does it look like when students meet expectations or exceed expectations. And those are terms that are coming from our student assessment committee, SAC, in terms of the official rubrics that we use that are integrated into Canvas. So that is one way, because you have to think about how am I going to engage in those assignments that lead to one of those happening or not meeting those expectations, and what happens after that. So because we want assessment to not be an add-on. Oh, thank you, WebEx. Fantastic. Because we don't want assessment to be an add-on like I treated it back in 2006, something to keep the HLC at bay. We really want it to, we need to use it to evaluate student performance. It shouldn't be a separate thing. Diagnose students that are struggling so we can give them the assistance they need. Evaluate our entire course performance to look for curriculum improvements overall so we can keep improving our courses over time. And yes, we need to keep the administrators and the accrediting agencies at bay. So it needs to hit all four of those targets for it to be effective assessment, in my opinion. So one of the ways I feel pretty strongly about now, and this is, I've learned this, I have a bibliography at the end of this presentation I won't bore you with, but since you have it, you can look at some of the great books I read. One of them was called Specifications Grading by Lyndon Nielsen in 2015. Talked about this idea of aligning student performance and assessment with their grades. And in a nutshell, what it basically means is that to take seriously that if a student meets all of the standards for your class, your course competencies, your program learning outcomes, that they should get a C, regardless of what else they do. Now, if they want to get a B or an A, well, they need to meet those standards, plus they have to demonstrate either more learning or a greater level of learning in the evidence that they provide. And if you think about that, that's quite the paradigm shift from the way most instructors teach, certainly the way I taught before my course redesign, when I was using the traditional points system, you'll be familiar with this, 90 to 100% is an A, 80 to 89% is a B, and so forth. In this new system of learning mastery, the focus is on student output. In other words, their learning outcomes, at the exclusion of pretty much everything else. Whereas in the traditional point system, it's some combination of inputs and outputs. So for example, attendance counts towards points in some cases, extra credit counts. And so it's really about whether the students are able to demonstrate their learning or not. I'm going to pause here because I know I just dropped this major learning mastery grading system and just see if there's anyone that has any questions or thoughts, some of which I'll clarify in a little bit, but. Okay. My motto in the class, I share this in the syllabus, I share it first day, first week in class, is it's high standards and low stakes. What I mean by that is that I do require students to demonstrate significant college level learning outcomes as part of their course. I reckon that this course transfers over to the state universities as part of a degree program, or the AJAC, if you will, General Education Curriculum. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we have sufficient evidence that students have mastered those learning outcomes that we said we're keeping them accountable for. However, I also understand that our students are developing as learners, as individuals, and there's a difference in diversity in terms of academic preparedness, in terms of needs for learning, and just basic study skills. So students may need feedback and additional support to master those high outcomes. And so I give them multiple opportunities to complete the assessments if they don't meet it at the first step. Indeed, I give them basically to the end of the semester, if they need it, to redo assessments from does not meet expectations to meet expectations. This also has the added benefit of students tend to take the feedback more seriously. One of the major gripes I hear from faculty is they spend a lot of time providing quality feedback to students, and it doesn't seem like they actually read it, given their future performance on other assignments. They don't seem to have digested it. In this particular case, they would need to consider the feedback. They have an incentive to consider the feedback because if they need to do the assessment again, they need to know what they did wrong. So I know what some of y'all are thinking. I don't have time to manage learning mastery. How many times do I have to grade the same darn assignment over and over again? Okay, well, there's a paradigm shift we need to make here. So unlike in the point system, there are no partial grading of student work. Either they get credit or they do not. Oftentimes what this means is it simplifies and quickens grading. I take a look at their assignment that they respond to, and generally speaking, in a very, very short period of time, I can collect enough evidence to see that yes, indeed, they are exceeding expectations, or whoa, you're way off track here. We might need an intervention, but at least, for this, at this point, this is not meeting expectations. It's those students that are in the middle where you're kind of deciding, okay, is this going to pass muster or not? That takes a little bit more time and reflection. But what I would say is that generally speaking, a student will know if they are not meeting expectations because they know that they don't know this information. It's not news to them. Of course, you do want to give them some feedback, especially if you think that could be helpful. And in other cases, you might just need to meet with a student one-on-one to kind of talk about, this is what we're expecting. But the other thing too is, in the points-based system, if you're giving partial credit, at least I found that if I gave anything less than 100% on a question, I felt like I had to give detailed feedback, more or less just to cover my rear. I needed to justify to the student why I gave them a B- as opposed to a B+, for example. And then it became kind of like a litigious, negotiation where students were like, well, if I did this, you didn't take in this into consideration, That's what we don't want to have. And all that kind of nitpicky grading takes a lot of time to do. Whereas if you are kind of like in the broad categories, you're exceeding expectations, meeting expectations, or not meeting expectations, it's kind of a lot more simple to do that. And so, yeah, sometimes for those does not meet expectations, students need to go back, redo them, and resubmit, and you regrade it. And usually they do a lot better that next time. But here's the key, is that for future assignments, they know that you're not messing around. Like, if I goof around here and I submit subpar work under the point system, well, I just got a bad grade. I'm moving on in life. At least I got some points instead of 0 points. Here, it's like that effort was useless. So might as well actually put the effort in to do it right the first time in the future. And so I'm tending to see, and that's what my preliminary results this semester are, the first few assessments were kind of ugly for some of the students. And now those same students are doing a lot better because they're kind of seeing that the bar is high and I got to get past that bar. Students may need additional guidance or attempts up front, but soon realize, not just as I was saying, what they need to do to get the desired results. In this class, there's no escape. You need to hit meets expectations on all your assignments, or there's withdrawal, right? So that it's a pretty stark contrast at that point. And the students, some students aren't going to be ready for that. But of course, some of those students in the point system aren't going to be ready for that either. So it kind of makes it evident, you gotta shape up or ship out, basically. So I'm going to pause here for another moment here because I talked a little bit more about mastery learning grading. I think that's probably the most controversial part of the redesign. If anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts?
I'm curious about your retention.
Yeah, well, I'm curious too because the semester hasn't ended yet.
Oh, okay.
I would say my 8-week online class that has the low support, I did have a kind of a drop off at the beginning. I don't know if that would have happened otherwise anyway. Certainly communicating the standards to students can be challenging because they want to look at their grade percentage in the class. And I have to tell them, look, your grade percentage is not a reflection of your grade. I've created a grading tracking tool that they can use to put in their grades, and it kind of tells them what they're on track for based on that. So granted, that's probably the weakest part of it. But for the students that are in there, I mean, I haven't got a lot of nasty grams for, Dr. H, this is, I don't understand it. I think I hate this, blah, blah, blah. That hasn't happened a lot. So, and for my 16-week class, I really haven't seen like a big rush for the door so far. I think mostly the students are getting it. Maybe they're not quite sure what's going on, but they're playing along. So that's a good question. Anyone else?
I had a question. So I feel, Mary has a question first, so let me go to her. Do you have a grading contract with students?
Yeah, so I have a grading. In fact, if you go to the course master, you could look on the syllabus. It's at the very end. It's a grading rubric, I call it. And it basically spells out what it takes to get an A, B, and C in the class. So that's very much like a grading contract. It's not exactly, my understanding of a grading contract is that you meet with each student and you decide, okay, what do you want to do and how will you do it? And if you do this, you get an A, or if you don't do that, you get a B or something. This is just like, okay, if you hit these targets, you get an A. If you hit these targets, you get a B and so forth. So in that way, yes. It's very clear what students need to do. And like I said, to get an A or a B, you have to do more learning and higher level learning than for a C. Liz?
So I was going to say, so I feel like some of the stuff that you are mentioning, Eric, is really almost having us in higher education, or at least if we're using learning mastery and the assessment instruments the way we do at Estrella to almost kind of shift students' understanding of performance in a college classroom over a high school, middle school, whatever. You know, because yes, the one question that makes me shrug a bit is, you know, what does it take to get an A? Or it's
Right.
very much focused on the points and more the evaluation of their performance and success via a letter grade over the actual learning process. And so
Right.
I almost feel like we just, you know, it's like you have to almost teach students how to unlearn how grading was done previous to higher ed. And like like so that's almost like a complete like it's a complete shift for them. And I don't know if they would understand it if they've been so immersed for, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so I almost wonder, like, maybe we can continue this conversation, you know, offline, but I just feel like, how do we start to make that? Because I feel it was very powerful when you said students maybe aren't ready. So what do you think it's going to take for us to get the students ready for that type of shift?
Right. Yeah, you know, I don't know if we can change the culture or the mindset that is hungry for a particular grade because that's been reinforced their whole life that the GPA is the only thing that matters. And so students are still motivated to get a grade. But the way that they do it, you change the incentives for how to do it, and that changes the way that they approach their studying and their learning. And the hope is, you know, a lot of students will appreciate more what's going on because they're engaged in those higher level learning activities. But I will say it takes a lot. You got to put the time in up front to make sure you communicate in multiple ways how this grading system's different. So I've created a video in Canvas Studio that walks through the grading rubric and what you need to do in order to do it. I gave rationale why, both in the video and in the Canvas page, as well as in the syllabus about why we're doing this. And then just like I said, the grading tools I think helpful. We'll see. I'm going to have them submit that as their grade check at the end of module 2. So we haven't quite gotten there yet, but to make sure that they understand how what their grade is and if that checks with what my understanding is. So a lot of communications involved with that, but ultimately what I'm looking for is that, you know, students are performing at the standard that I'm expecting them to if they are to quote unquote pass the class. Did I answer your question, Liz? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it does. And I think I'm trying to think about just some of the research I've read on like alternative grading, you know, like labor-based grading,
Yeah.
in the respect of that tries to get students a bit off the points and letter grade and more on effort, performance, and like achieving the learning outcomes and learning and the course competencies through different instruments. And I think that the assessment instruments is key.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with labor-based grading. My impression would be that's still that's measuring inputs as opposed to outputs. And you know, one of the things that we want, and I might be wrong about that, but one of the things, you know, we want to do is kind of measure and certify what students are able to do at the end of class. So, but at the same time, it's similar in the sense that there is this gradation of, you know, more performance, higher grade as a result. So maybe different philosophy there, but. All right, well, I'm going to move on. So we talked about learning outcomes, assessments. I want to come back to meaningful and high impact learning experiences because that's the third part of the backwards design. And this is, you know, one of my methodologies for my course modalities. You'll see in my course master, it's called multi. So it's not the course master is not for online or for in-person. It's basically for all econ courses. It's just that it's a matter of how much in-person support one's going to get. For online, everything's there that you need to succeed. You have textbook readings from my OER textbook that I use, lecture videos, either for myself or curated from around the web, low or no stakes practice games, quizzes, flashcards, practice assessments. Students can do quite well only online. But for those that would like a little bit more support, they can choose a hybrid or a face-to-face version. And I basically think of this as online plus. So you get the same online content for the foundational learning experiences, plus you have that in-class experience where you experience the flipped classroom or higher level just-in-time learning. And I would add, and it's also a lot of fun, I think, at least for me. I think a lot of students we went back to, how do you see it in the eyes? You see it in the energy in the classroom. You see it in the questions. They're not packing up 7 minutes early. They're glued to the seats, all that good stuff. We have just to I love this. This is from the UT Austin, I believe, system. Students are preparing for class just like they would as an online students, watching the videos and the lectures. They're doing an adaptive homework. We use a product called Newton Alta from Wiley. I'm not a sponsor of them, or they of me, but it is an OER, $30 for each student for the semester, and it's an adaptive homework assignment. So if students are doing really well, they move through the questions to get to mastery. And if students are struggling, then they get fed additional content and different instructional approaches using their large database in order to help students develop mastery. And they have to develop foundational mastery before coming to class as one of the assignments. So that's kind of a big thing for students. It's like, how can you hold me accountable for this before coming to class? Well, you have all the resources there. And this is what the online students would have to go through anyway. And so when they come to class, I don't have to treat them like blank slates. I can say, okay, you have some knowledge here, so let's take it to the next level. And now I'm practicing recall as opposed to presenting information to them. And filling in the gaps, helping them practice recall, all that stuff so that they can do well and higher level learning on the assessments when that happens after they after they go home. We check for students' understanding. I personally use Respondus Lockdown plus Monitor for my assessments. That is to ensure that they are not going to ChatGPT or other generative AI to put my question prompts in and answer, because that locks down their browser from doing that. The Monitor prevents them from having their cell phone or a secondary laptop that they could use, or a friend in the room. It's a little Orwellian. That's one of the things I don't like about it. But it is a way to, I believe, ensure quality and that their responses are authentic. And so what's next for me real fast, I am looking forward to seeing the assessment results. Each of those assessments is tied, Najma could explain this maybe better, but it's tied at what they call the sub-account level of the college system. So when students are answering their assessments and prompts and I'm grading them, I'm giving them a 3 for exceeds expectations, 2 for meets, 1 for does not meet, or 0 for not attempted. Those data get compiled at our Office of Planning and Institutional Effectiveness, OPI, into the dashboard. And then based on the SIS data of the students, we can start slicing and dicing that data to look for trends to see how well our first generation students or veteran students or students of color versus white or older students versus traditional age students doing in these classes at various different learning outcomes, so that we can start making improvements and kind of tailoring the class over time to address those, I like to call them opportunity gaps. Sometimes people call them equity gaps in the instruction. So, and I also compile that with student evaluation scores, success rates, kind of have a holistic, I wouldn't call it a program review, but something similar to that to kind of see what does the performance of this class look like. So yeah, that's what I'm looking for. I went to Tableau today, and apparently fall 2024 is not up yet. So I'm sitting on pins and needles to see what that is. So I'm going to stop there. I do want to show you that if you go to the end of my slide, I have various awesome resources, things I read along the way that help formulate my ideas. Oh, look, Liz, I even had an evaluation that I didn't update. Because I knew that the CTL team was so amazing that they would be helping me out with the evaluation anyway. But I wanted to share that in case you wanted to delve deeper into any of those subjects. But I want to say, y'all have questions now that we finished up the presentation. I could jump into the course master. I could also jump into Socrative. This is my polling software that I use with my students. I was using it this morning. Boy, is it so much fun. Clarissa has her hand up.
I was just saying I could put that in the chat. Let me just go ahead. What I want to know is when you said using the course competencies for our ILO, all of them, or just choose some?
Yeah, so this is a great opportunity for me to jump into my course master. And if you go to outcomes, I don't know if you can see these as an observer, but yeah, I have every single course competency loaded up in the system. So if you went to the Maricopa Curriculum CCTA, something like that, curriculum transfer articulation. This is word for word what you would see for the course competencies. Students will be able to define key vocabulary in economics. Students will be able to discuss foundational economic principles. Every one of these is assessed at some point in my course. So if you go to modules, I'm glad you brought this up because I think this is a really cool feature. And we are kind of looking at assessing program learning outcomes at this college. So our course competencies in economics are mapped to our program learning outcomes. So for example, let me go down here to market theory, which is one of the subjects we're on right now. I have practice assessments for them. And let's take a look at M1 assessment 4. So here are some examples. For them to meet expectations, they need to describe the law of demand, contrast a change in demand from a change in quantity demanded, and so forth. Tell me what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when demand increases or decreases. For them to exceed expectations, they need to show me what happens when demand and supply change. If you're not an econ person, I'm sorry, that's probably a lot of gibberish that just made you fall asleep. But here's what I really wanted to show you, is that when you show the rubric, indeed, it's tied to the CLO. Students will be able to describe the determinants of supply and demand, which happens to be the same PLO. Now, they're not always word for word the same. Sometimes, for example, let me take a look at macro measures. So how do we measure the economy? Excuse me, don't want to give anyone vertigo. Okay. Here's a good one. Okay. So, oops, I don't want to do that. Show rubric. Okay, so here's a good example. So in macroeconomics, students will be able to explore measures of the economy's performance, GDP, inflation, unemployment. And that's tied to the more generalized idea students will be able to interpret economic data. That CLO looks differently in our microeconomics course. Like, for example, we might be asking them about elasticity coefficients. but it's still students are able to interpret economic data. So when I'm grading students, I give them the points and I also click on, they're always the same. They're always 3 and 3, 2 and 2, 1 on 1. But the way the data is sliced and diced in the back office is different for assessing at the program versus the course level, if that makes sense. So to answer your question, every CLO and every PLO, I even have some writing and critical thinking questions I have a reflection assignment at the end of each module where I ask them, I can give you a quick preview of that if you're interested. All right, you can imagine how my students feel. M1 reflection assignment, where I have students in 200, 300 words reflect and write about key ideas or insights from the class so far. So this is really connecting to their personal experience. What does this mean for them, their careers, their families, whatever? I think I have, oops, that's not it. Okay, rubric's not here, excuse me. But in some of these assignments, obviously not in M1, I have a rubric here where I'm asking them in these 300 words, I'm assessing, are they writing clearly? Are they using proper grammar? Are they using higher learning thinking skills and so forth? And that's how I collect ILO information. So all 3 levels of outcomes are measured in the class. Oh, you probably want to take a look at the syllabus. There's, I think Mary had a question about that. I'm using the CTL's default syllabus. So here's this is kind of the grading contract, the grading rubric. So to get a C or P in the class, you'll notice that they really don't need to do anything except complete all of the assessments, and there's a lot of assessments at the need expectation level or higher. Now to get a B, they're going to need to do everything except 2 of the getting started assignments. They need to do all the homeworks at 80% of them at 80% level or higher. You got to get a 70% after 2 chances on the final exam. And then to get an A, it steps up higher from there. So they have to hit all of the requirements for a particular area to get to that grade. So it's a little high stakes in that regard. But again, the way I say it, and I tell that to students, is my goal is to get you passing the class. If you want to get an A or B, the expectations are clear and you can go for it. But that's up to students to do that.
The quizzes, they get multiple attempts. What about the assessments?
Yeah, so the quizzes are the assessments. So well, actually, yeah, so just to kind of clarify terms, modules. So in a regular instruction, like let's say, this is true for my online, or if they're going to my in-person class, this is what they'd be responsible for doing before coming to class. This is like the learning page. I have the learning objectives. I have the key terms. I have the textbook reading. That links directly to the OER textbook. I have any other outside reading. I have a curation of videos that I think are relevant to the learning objectives that they can watch. You can see that here. So it is a bit of a choose your own adventure. You can do all of them. You can do some of them. And then I wish this was a live course, because then you would see the homework system pop up. And this is the adaptive learning. And so you can do this as long or as many times as you want to get to an 80%, 90%, or 100%, depending on what you're shooting for. But then at the end of the module, that's when you're going to be coming to the assessments. And these assessments, just like you said, say that. I have for them, what do they need to do to exceed expectations? What do they need to do to meet expectation? What do they do if they, and obviously if you don't meet expectations, you did not meet expectations. And then that's when they would be submitting this assignment. Here's another thing I hadn't mentioned. I think this might be a good idea, is I have a due date for the assignment. Let's say it's due today, Wednesday. I'll have it due on Wednesday, but it's not going to close until next Wednesday. So if a student, you know, turns it in a day or two late, they're still able to turn it in. It gives me some time to grade them. When I grade them, if they meet expectations or exceed, that's fantastic. If they haven't, they have until the end of that window to resubmit the assessment. And then I just go back and there's 2 or 3 or 5 of them that I have to take a look at. Usually the second time around, it's much better, as you might imagine. But there are some students that don't submit adequately or completely miss the window after that week. And then at that point, we need to have a discussion, even if it's just an online one, about what's going on, you know? Why is it that you're not meeting expectations on these assessments 1 week after it's due? You know, and 80% of the students so far, in my experience, are like, I've just been really busy at work, you know, I got such and such going on with family. You know, what I'm planning on doing is carving out time, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, hey, awesome. I'm going to open this up for you for an additional week. I do track that on a separate sheet just to make sure that there's not an abuse going on here. But generally speaking, they don't want to reach out to their instructor and ask for an extension if they can help it. And then they start realizing, okay, again, if I just do the work right the first time, you know, I can just totally avoid this whole situation. And I think it's a little bit of upfront training for the students to figure out what it takes for them to be successful on these. And then they start operating at this higher level. And I think that's kind of where I would leave it. It's just like, that's where we want our students to be doing is getting to that point where they're demonstrating, they're meeting and exceeding our expectations consistently throughout the class. And I do see that we're off time. So I will say thank you so much for joining me today. I am glad to continue the conversation. Please just send me a message. Oh, thanks. Send me an email. I am running another session in October. It's going to be a lot of the same ground, but I will have updates on that if you wanted to come back or tell one of your friends and colleagues. But otherwise, yeah, I totally fall on my nose on this one. I'll make sure to mention that too. Run screaming for the door back to the point system. But you know what? So far it's been okay. You know, my greatest anxieties have not come true, and it's been fun to get back in the classroom.
Well, you did have Clarissa's hand is still up. I don't know if that's a legacy hand.
It is, sorry.
Okay, no worries. And then I believe you addressed the how many attempts on the assessments, Eric?
Yeah, multiple attempts, unlimited attempts, but the window closes after a period of time. So that's, at least for the assessments, that's basically my rule.
Great.
Well, thank you, Eric. I can't wait to hear how this all works out at the end of the semester. I'd be curious to hear what the outcome is.
Well, like even though I love that, my favorite measurement I forgot to mention when we talked about how do you know there's a great class is when a student comes up to me and says, you know, I was talking with my mom and dad about, you know, the new tax cut going on or the new spending bill. And I was talking to them about what the impact will be on inflation and unemployment. Or my favorite was, you know, a student came up and I was like, I was talking about Keynesian theory at this party I was at the other weekend. I'm like, holy smokes, your econ geek flag is flying high, my friend. Well done. It's like, that's how I know a class is working for me. So hopefully I'll have more of those in the future.
Very cool, Eric.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.